How far did you think you would get, on your own, a boy of 11? At another deserted farmhouse in the French countryside a fortnight after Boxing Day, Severus Snape had raised his wand at sunrise and had placed an imperturbability spell, lighting a smokeless fire in the hearth before apparating some food. It had been a long time since Septimus had had real food. He and Snape had subsisted on sandwiches and sausage rolls as they used the cover of darkness to fly between places that his headmaster had determined were uninhabited. As the child began to tuck in, with some eagerness, into his food, Snape's hand curled around the Veritaserum potion which he knew Septimus would need again, and looked around at the decor. The farmhouse, once clearly the heart of someone's family life, pictures still hung on the walls, curtains had been lovingly handmade, was now abandoned. Broken furniture lay around them, and the bedsteads, above in a platform near the roof, were beyond use. Not that it mattered to Snape. He would, as he had done since their departure on Boxing Day, apparat more furniture to keep them comfortable as they slept and keep the fire going overnight so that neither of them would freeze. He had done this since the beginning. France was a big country, Septimus was realizing, and its scenery mile after mile, morning after morning, was not much different. I don't know, sir, Septimus replied as, for once, Snape has decided that a cooked meal was in order, and he tucked keenly into the warming stew of his headmaster's own recipe. He had also chosen to have a conversation with Septimus, something that the boy was astonished about, and he chose to reply honestly. I was actually very angry. Angry? About everything, Septimus explained, blowing on the vegetables which were incredibly hot, trying not to burn his mouth. About Dad still being ill, about Mum on her way, but then disappearing. About Mrs. Potter. Yes, angry, Snape echoed. And you think the answer to your anger is to run off from your guardians? Septimus stopped. He didn't know what he would have done, if truth be told. If Snape had not caught up with him, would he have got this far into France on his own? Would he still be alive? Mum used to let me go down to the shops when I was 8. I went to the city sometimes on the train and the bus when I was 9. I am not questioning your ability to be able to get to the Buxbottom's Academy, Snape replied evenly, but this country is fraught with danger, all of Europe is, Britain too. There are some wizards who would delight in finding a young wizard child alone. Conjurists. Yes, admitted Snape, helping himself to a second bowl. But, aren't they supposed to abide by the law? Have you abided by the law? Septimus felt his confidence fall. He hadn't, of course. And conjurists seemed to be the least law-abiding wizards of the lot. So, if you don't abide by it, what makes you think that a group of wizards with extreme views will? Our government is failing, Septimus. Yes. Failing, he added, as the young boy shot his head round to look at his headmaster. Your uncle could not manage to keep the peace, with or without the help of the non-wizards. He has sent the homing bees, time flies, to follow you. Not that it has done much good to them. The European government is just about to tie itself in knots with the legal challenge, a legal declaration of wizards' rights. Distractions on this scale leave voids, spaces where their minds cannot be occupied, and these voids are filled with all manner of evil, poor judgment, imposition of will on others, scapegoating, manipulation. It is unfortunate that these human characteristics are the ones which are first to arise. Time flies? Asked Septimus, the most he had gleaned from Snape's monologue. You can't have failed to notice the little cloud of insect-like things which have been following us? Oh, that's what they are, time flies? Homing bees? Both, repeated Severus. They were designed to track escapee prisoners. Time flies when you're having fun, or so the saying goes. But, at Azkaban it goes, time flies when you're on the run. They fell to silence at this, as the weak sunrise suggested the beginning of the day. 14 days and Septimus and Severus had not talked like this. Up till then the ex-headmaster had gone along with Septimus's idea of getting to the French wizarding school and had been at pains to make sure they remained concealed. Now, 50 miles away from the French coast, in the area of mostly deserted plain that had once been home to people who had farmed the land, Severus Snape had begun to ask searching questions. "Headmaster," said Septimus, once he had finished his food. "Am I wrong in doing this? Do you feel wrong in doing this?" No, Septimus thought immediately, as Snape cleared away the breakfast things, or were they the dinner things? "Where is Mum, Professor? I'll find her," he added, determinedly. "I need answers." At this Snape turned in the process using a spell to make up 2 beds in the loft above, lowering his wand and looking at his young charge. "Do you remember a witch by the name of Miss Penright?" Septimus nodded, thinking of the pale-faced woman he had once seen with Snape at one of the reciprocator meetings. "She worked in the ministry. She worked with my uncle." "Listen very carefully when I tell you this," Snape growled, wheeling round to Septimus. "Your mother was foolish enough to write a book when she had come ... just before you were born. Do you remember it?" "The story that never was," clarified Septimus, weakly. Suddenly the simple task of finding a wizard in France seemed to be getting rather complicated. "Your mother is an exceptionally gifted non-wizard and, in her absence from you at Durmstrang, has been able to aid not only your father's recovery but also work towards fighting the darkness that confronts us every day. You see, our enemy will not out and out fight us, not like in the old days of wizardry. Our enemy, the conjurists, the wizards who control the conjurists, are exceptionally intelligent. They have chosen to fight us here." Snape tapped the side of his head as he leaned against the inner planks that made up the roof. Dust and splinters fell around him. "Inner minds?" asked Septimus, looking hopeful. Snape sank down onto the larger bed. "In our day-to-day world, through legislation with unintended consequences, through rumor and public influence. And yes, through our minds. They seek to divide us, divide non-wizards and wizards, to divide wizards and wizards. But yet, the prize they seek is out of this world, so to speak. That is where Miss Penright's work comes in." "Professor," said Septimus, not following Snape up to the farmhouse's loft, where they were to sleep until evening and they could continue west again, "what is Miss Penright's work? And how does my mother fit into all of this? When I say that it is out of this world, it is what I mean. It exists in a different plane of reality, a different place divided by dimensions that are not of our time, nor theirs. It is where thoughts and memories are housed as and exist, well, physically, like a dimension all to themselves. Time flows differently, if it flows at all. It is through this that the great and powerful, terrible and awe-inspiring wizards target, and unfortunately, through with good intentions, your mother wrote about this place." Septimus felt his mouth fall open. "Wow!" he exclaimed. "I don't really understand what you mean, but seems incredible," said Snape. "Yes. And, if I am honest, I don't fully understand what it means. It takes a certain wizard to begin to understand it, let alone work with it." "And Mum wrote a book about it?" "She didn't know that it was that plane of existence she was writing about," Snape clarified. "Does Uncle K know?" Severus Snape didn't answer for a moment, as he thought of the Minister for Magic, and his role in this all. "Yes, Septimus. He certainly does. And he has it under control, there is no doubt about that, or at least, he thinks he does. But it is that place that the wizards who we believe have taken your mother want to exploit, to control, to manipulate. By taking Cecilia, they believe that she will be able to help them. Unfortunately, I suspect that she knows far less than they believe." "And what happens when they find out?" Snape did not reply at once. Instead, climbing the rickety ladder which led up to the hay loft, he turned and added over his shoulder, "That is not something about which I would like to speculate. However, your visit to Constantine, to find out the answers you seek, may turn out to be advantageous both to your mother's as well as your father's situations. Injuring two nifflers with one well-stuffed money bag, so to speak." "Is this?" asked Septimus, sitting on the bed, his shoulders flopping down. "Is this why I have not been brought home? 'Cause I know Uncle K could do it, if he wanted. Let's just say your visit to Xpitons will answer questions beyond the wizard Constantine and his ability to make a vampire cure." There was silence again. In the morning sunlight, which was growing stronger and beating down through the gaps in the ceiling, Snape swung himself, fully clothed, onto his bed and closed his eyes. "I heard Dad say something to Sirius once," said Septimus, climbing up behind Headmaster. "He said that she was the biggest mistake he had ever made and he wished she had never ruined his life. Does my dad hate Mum? Sirius has strong views on many things, including your mother, and it does not mean Remus was right." Snape's eyes remained closed and he spoke to the ceiling. "If Mum and Dad not been together, I would not be born. I owe it to them." "Yes, indeed." Snape did not expand on this, but Septimus looked as if he needed an explanation to such a wretched situation, something which had clearly been on his mind for some time. "If your Mum and Dad had not been together you would not have been born, that is quite right, but they were, and so here you are. Septimus," he continued, sitting down on the temporary bed, "are you still happy with the choice you made? There is always time to change the path you are taking. If I go back, and do nothing, then I cannot help them. You know that you suffer lycanthropy, and yet neither Remus Lupin nor Cecilia Lupin are werewolves?" "Yes, I had wondered, ever since you told me, Headmaster," Septimus admitted. "The man you call your father is not your father, biologically speaking." "Remus Lupin is not my father." "Remus Lupin is your father," Snape replied. "It is a complicated situation and it all comes from Cecilia Lupin's connection with the other plane of existence, something which has nothing to do with the world in which we live." "Like heaven? Like quantum physics? We are in the universe, correct?" Septimus nodded, sitting down on the bed that Snape had conjured for him. "How do you know?" "We are here," he said. "This is Earth. It's a big rock falling through space around the sun, which is a star. It has gravity and speed and plants and elements on it." "That's science." "Yes," nodded Snape. "Go on." "And we exist, and we think, and wizards change energy into spells, and non-wizards can't. And you can think these things, Septimus. So, what are thoughts? How do they exist?" "Well, He tailed off. "Thoughts. How do they exist?" Mum had gone through these things with him, scientific ideas. Thoughts were electrochemical processes in the brain. But what caused them? And they certainly existed, or else how did humans make decisions about things? There is the plane of reality hidden to us. Wizards capture thoughts and can suspend them in that place, a place which has no name. A place, until recently, no one thought a human could go. And darling Tabitha proved us all wrong. But your mother made a grave error, an error which has cost her her liberty. Yes, she was encouraged to do so by Aberforth Dumbledore. You know who he is, do you not? Yes, said Septimus weakly. His own thoughts now disparate in his mind were, not an hour before, they were crystallized into a sharp point which pointed in the direction of Xpitons and Constantine the vampire researcher. And now Remus Lupin both was and wasn't his father at the same time. Yes, your parentage is complicated, and one day you will find the answer you seek. But there are more pressing matters. Snape opened his eyes, stood up, cracking his head on the beams of the farmhouse roof and doing his best not to swear, opening his cloak and pulling out a book, and then another, and then a pile of parchments, and then more papers, another book and a ream of paper, the left-hand side of the cloak acting as an area where the dimensions of objects could be reduced to thousands of times larger or, in this case, smaller. The screaming was deafening, but Snape silenced it within a few seconds. Your mother's research, abandoned, of course, on her abduction. What do you notice about it? Septimus peered down onto the pages, her mother's untidy lettered words staring back at him. And then, before his eyes, something else appeared. It's being written. Yes. Can you not guess by whom? Septimus peered down. A trail of words were making their way across the page, like black tiny bubbles popping on the surface of a cream-colored pond in her uneven hand. Mum? These are hers? She's alive? Indeed. And, wherever she is, she's stirring up memories, as she had done with all the work she had produced for your uncle, Septimus, and those memories are being recorded here. I even have the best she and Lindveld Halen produced in Remus Lupin's Cure. He withdrew another paper, this one rolled up tidily in S thin tube and sealed with a red Durmstrang seal. Septimus craned over to see, reading words which were very long and complicated, scientific words, he was sure. Medical words, perhaps. He looked up at Snape. Constantin should read these, for Dad, he said, a firmness in his voice that Snape had hitherto not heard before. Should you so choose. But choose wisely. We are to get to Buxbaton's by this time tomorrow. He leaned across to Septimus and put a kindly hand on his shoulder. But yes, she is with you, Septimus, wherever she is. She may be out of sight, but she is not dead. Cecilia Lupin is very much alive. Now, he said, removing the silencing spell and shrinking Cecilia's 2 years of research into his robe again, try to get some sleep. We shall be at Buxbaton's very soon. 88,888,888. I cannot believe this is what he is proposing, Pomona. Minerva McGonagall slapped the notice onto the desk of her opposite number. The head of House of Hufflepuff creased her eyebrows into a frown as she picked up the paper that she had thrown onto her desk. Practical defense? They have always done practical defense, haven't they? Pomona Sprout replaced the parchment onto Minerva's desk, having scrutinized it thoroughly. Practical means defense spells, does it not? But not to this extent. The students have only ever disarmed. I mean, they complain when they get back to the common room that it was all well and good they were taught to disarm an opponent, and what good will that do them in real life, but this? Well. Minerva McGonagall folded her arms. Defending territory against enemies? The impervious charm? Dark magic protection? He's not at Durmstrang now, he does know that, surely? And we have non-wizards here too. Whatever will Callias say? Remember what it was like ... before Aberforth. Pomona sat down at Minerva's desk, on a chair usually reserved for perpetrators of misdemeanors, and bit into an apple. We have never taught these students defensive spells before, she conceded, and ... like preparing them as soldiers ... for an army. Never. Aberforth and Cleus put a stop to that, declared Pomona, hotly. Fundamental magic, Pa. She bit hard into the green flesh of the apple. However, she continued, her outburst gone, maybe it is merely a plan to teach the students in line with Durmstrang. I mean, after all, the students there head for great jobs within the wizarding world, Buxbatons, who similarly teach their girls also excel. But we have never done it. Fumed Minerva, throwing down the missive that repulsed her. And the Contations ... what will they make of it? What will their parents make of it, and the wizarding world? I mean, he began this morning, and we have not even sent out permission owls to their parents. Professor Sprout said nothing, but chewed on her apple carefully. "Pomona," she began again, this time her tone a little more controlled. "I speak to you as I have known you the longest. We have worked here the best part of 50 years. I am concerned with the well-being of our students. Yes, of course, we must accept Professor Halen as headmaster, but there seems to be several illnesses amongst the returning non-wizards again, like the last time, and yet some within the wizards too." She sat down in her own chair. "And Miss Brant concerns me to a great extent. She sickens and pales daily. She has her watchstone, but she is frequently shunning other students, seeking her own company, or is out of lessons. Too often she is with Sam Potter, and they are both losing lesson time as a consequence. Sam has missed 2 Newt deadlines already." Minerva turned suddenly, as if expecting to see someone standing next to her, screwed up her nose, which resulted in her glasses falling down her nose. Hastily, she pushed them back on and looked back at the same place where she had before, her eyes falling on nothing. Tabitha Penwright stared back at her. So soon? Had it been the mention of Crystal Lear which had led from Nicholas Flamel, his dying wife, his bond with a long-missing, nefarious wizard to secure an eternal youth potion to keep Perinel from passing from his world? Nevertheless, it had led her here. But for what? Time had flown past from the theoretical point at which she, Tabitha, had begun on her mission behind the veil. Considering the timeline, all these people that she had known nearly a decade ago were now well progressed. Perhaps it was true what the physicists said, that an object accelerates towards a black hole. It certainly felt as if time had, for Severus's timeline, accelerated in relation to her own. She climbed back up, carefully and evenly, making sure that the memory she had entered was tethered securely next to the one in which she had visited Flamel. None of these memories were coincidental. Indeed, it was their very nature and substance which meant she could find them so easily. And now, to another nebulous dimension the man who some time ago between both the coming towards Tabitha at speed and the going away from her had gone. Across the semi-solid clouds Tabitha looked, and waited. It would not be long until the next part of the plan she had hypothesized would be. It was difficult, Tabitha considered, to relate the quantum nature of the place. It existed, insofar that you could say existed could describe here. Physicists spoke of other dimensions than the other 3, 4th being time, and 5th onwards venturing into string theory. Physicists could never enter an actual physical place wherein excited the rest of their proposed dimensions, only express them numerically, in equations which proved one another's existence. But here, it was as if the theory of the string dimensions was actually made real. Memories of different times and even different dimensions were collected, unstratified, unclassifiable, unending. Time did not exist wherein the way it had where she had come from would come from in the world time passed from moment to moment. But here, it was as if every second was passing at the same time. For Tabitha, everything was also happening together. Sometimes the events outside the clouds may happen in any order, cause did not necessarily follow effect. However, in the broad picture, the broadest, there were some things what would happen here, overlooking the memory clouds, offering some connectedness, some progress, of a sort, was happening. The man who had been there before, when the false memory had caused uproar, had gone now, having, for want of better words, rounded up the memories for her because of his very particular presence. The clouds were coalescing by themselves now, without her help, because of him. Others would join them, or already had. And, if Tabitha's memory of the present she had left was correct, as much as it could be, totting up her time in comparison to all of the other realities, about half the time that wasn't passing here had gone. Some sort of period of time, meaning the other half would see. Thinness, transparency. Interconnectedness would follow. But that was not yet. Tabitha breathed deeply. Multidimensional physics would be so much easier to understand if the physicists weren't relying on a language that had evolved to communicate to your tribe where the best fruit was, or to avoid the large, stripy cat. Halfway. Tabitha had already that memory, like an anchor, with her, Cecilia. Before any part of her would be able to rationalize it, the coalescing would eventually accelerate to beyond the speed of light, and there would be no going back. Back in the cloud in which she had left Professors McGonagall and Sprout, the conversation was coming to an end, with doubting acceptance. Yes, I can see your point, but it is the future for these children which is of my concern. I cannot see any other way than to approach Lindfeldhalen on the matter. In spite his years, which are few, he is a most capable headmaster to replace Severus. What other choice do you have? None that I know of, Pomona, and that's what worries me. 88,888,888. The legislation was going to keep them busy for some time. Albus Dumbledore descended the steps from Cecilia and over towards a desk piled high with the recent Communist pamphlets, due to be delivered by his national agents tonight. Agents. He preferred loyalists. Yes, they would do, to keep the wheels of revolution turning. But it would be the call to law to clarify the position of wizards which would speed up and embed their cause most beautifully. Bruick was an undersignatory to the declaration, his interests being to protect the Durmstrang Institute from pollution and to guarantee protections for the wizardly way of life. In short, no further integration both at Durmstrang, and in society in general. It was a bold assertion. And yet, with the traitor more than willing to their cause, Dumbledore will have his arena, and his audience. He glanced upwards for a moment. She was asleep, Mrs. Lupin. Still, in her dress, her face tear-stained, asleep. Unconscious, not for this world. Visit to the land of dreams, spell keeping her sedated for easy access to her memories. But, it was proving difficult. Like a radio broadcast in a foreign language, the memories had to be interpreted, evaluated, their worth to wizards' intended destination analyzed. And, now almost 3 weeks after acquiring her, the third intransmutable object from where she had come from, a small part of Albus Dumbledore wondered whether it was possible Cecilia Lupin was eluding his efforts to share the secrets of her mind somehow. He looked back to the prime pensieve, its ether swirling and writhing, formless. Had it been so long since he built it, and dreamed of controlling all through memories alone? How foolish he had been then. But, it had its purpose, for he would never have considered the possibility of whatever it was he and Gellet were doing now. The place of memories as a physical place was labyrinthine. One could easily get lost, double back, take a detour and be there forever. He would have to keep his head. Meanwhile, to any outsider, the woman lying peacefully on the bed was a modern-day fairy tale character waiting to be woken, surrounded as she was, in the Black Forest chalet belonging to Albus Dumbledore and Gelett Grindelwald at the start of the German Alps. Where to begin? What was the issue? Dumbledore considered. Her mind was willing to spill secrets. He had already seen, but they were of no consequence. They would not be efficient fuel for the prime pensieve to build up a location, people, places. While Grindelwald had his job manipulating, corrupting and buying the European Wizarding Council, on balance of things his job was a far easier than Albus's. But, what did they have was time, for the wizards in the Ministry of Magic had yet to uncover the most important piece, the person which linked it all together. Then, while Lucius Malfoy and Peter Pettigrew were not necessarily the most honest of wizards, they were motivated by honor, power and glory, and he would be able to present this person when he and Gelett were just ready. Albus ascended the stairs again, bending carefully over Cecilia, pondering the foolishness of his brother, trying to keep her hidden as he had done. Didn't he know that he would have her in his power in due course? Or had he put his faith in one in the Ministry whose loyalty could not be bought by any means? Callias Lupin? myopic, trusting in human nature. Trusting lichen nature. So, Mrs. Lupin, where to begin? Ah yes, Mrs. Frobisher, it's all here. But, how to understand? Got to choose the right place, the right path. The memory of a wizard with whom Albus Dumbledore was most interested and who he was most anxious to meet began to unravel itself, like nebulous spaghetti from Cecilia's temple. 88,888,888. Oh, quick! Huggy Bear. Down the corridor they tore, round the bend, and standing before the thin Lady Julian, Darren and Rufus stood, trying to remember the day's password. Once they had set eyes in their natural philosophy teacher accelerating in their direction. But, before they could speed up too obviously themselves, and finding the portrait stuck fast, the teacher called back, in his Dumfries accent, "And where do youse all think you are going out of hours?" Rufus had been training Doriel to detect radio signals, which influence his plants, commenting to both Julian and Darren that she was very put out at not having Septimus around, which prompted Julian to comment, "Me and her both." "But, what use is it, if?" Darren had asked, throwing a quibble ball between foot and hand. "That I can do it, it doesn't have to have a purpose, I've just found out that it's possible." Rufus had fussed little Doriel as she returned from a spot between the radio and the knife-flowering jasmines, invisible to them, but clearly of electromagnetic significance. He had explained how at night, radio signals traveled further and were stronger, and he was going to compare these observations with ones, eventually, in the day. To see where the point lay, Rufus had marked its position on a string, which stretched from one end of the greenhouse to the other, a piece of red ribbon, to match the others, in a kind of pattern on the same strings and ones below and above it. Julian squinted, trying to make something out, but then went back to staring at the floor. "It wouldn't surprise me," Rufus had continued, regardless of the fact that neither Julian or Darren had continued the conversation, "if the radio frequencies, the particular vibrations, had a role in controlling the growing time of plant, or quality thereof. Especially when the stone is vibrating." "Are you saying something in this stone is affecting time?" asked Julian, their expert geologist. "Could be. It's happening with these plants, whether or not the stone is there." "So they are experiencing time differently to us?" Julian frowned, but tried to look interested. "You know how a fly can move faster than you can swat it? That is the stone's influence, and now look at this. Plants that do not necessarily have that effect are being influenced by the stone." "What about these plants?" Darren had asked, suddenly interested. He rested the quibble ball down on the floor and looked intriguingly at the set of plants closest to him. "One type are dead, nearly. They've been affected by the magical plants, nearly killed off by their presence. It's really sad. Professor Longbottom had been working on them to try to keep them alive when they are with their magical equivalents." "Indeed," Professor Longbottom had explained, coming into the greenhouse carefully, closing the door quickly behind him. "And there had been illnesses again. Wizards and non-wizards, in my opinion, should not be in close proximity to one another. A pseudo-magic can illnesses, but can convey magical ability to some people too. Look here," he'd bent closer to the ones near Darren. "Some of these dead plants, non-magical, had the ability to grow shepherd's purse pods with the tiny money in same way that the magical variety do. However, being near to the magical plants has killed them." Julian and Darren exchanged sudden glances. "I have reported this," Neville Longbottom had continued, "and my hypothesis that can be seen between wizards and non-wizards. It's not a very popular cultural and social opinion at the moment. Politically the ministry want to convey the opposite, and my evidence flies in the face of it. But I have duly reported this to Malfoy at Strasbourg." "What?" Julian had asked, when his mouth had found the words that his brain didn't really want said aloud. "Do you mean, people could develop magic too? Non-wizards?" borrow wands and do magic? But some people are ill, Darren reminded them. Aaron Cruglington, and Humphrey Luckwood, twice. And Luckwood was able to do a transfiguration spell the other day. Both of them were new at the start of this term. And I heard Jason tell Sam he had been able to do a levitation spell. Wow, that would be something. How many people know about this? Few. Yes, Longbottom confirmed solemnly, scrutinizing Rufus's strong labels. Phantom symptoms, a weak version of magic, to lull the non-magical thing into believing it is doing well, but dying. My theory is that, historically, people discovered this and magical people and non-wizards separated themselves out and grew separately. I warned Professor Snape, and Professor Aberforth Dumbledore. This was just after his brother's treachery, of course. Treachery? The professor before Professor Snape's brother? I know who you mean, said Darren Black, suddenly, his face lighting up. Albus Dumbledore. He had experimented on students, hadn't he? Tried to get them to do dark magic? Tried to get them to form an army, Dumbledore's army. Hence Aberforth taking over. Yes, Professor Longbottom had confirmed, almost dismissively. And it had taken all the will of the three boys, well, the two of them who were now most interested, and Rufus, who would contribute, on point, at regular intervals, to not discuss the matter until they had got back to the common room, when Rufus had finished. And they were there, almost. We had permission from Professor Longbottom, garbled Julian Scott, pulling out a scrappy, handwritten parchment from his pocket, confirming it. Darren and Rufus produced theirs, too. All right, said John Huxley Baird, his rough voice sounding the word in the darkness. But, don't let me catch you a minute past. He glanced down at his pocket watch, which was slipped out of his waistcoat pocket, and then back to the note, which he then placed back in Julian's hand, 9:30 again. And with that, their teacher turned on his heel and strode off stiffly in the direction of the Ravenclaw common room. When at last the boys managed to get inside, none of them could talk sensibly at first, so quickly that they wanted to speak. Darren pulled them over to some empty chairs near one corner of the common room into a close circle. Julian and Rufus helped, then jumped on them. All three boys looked at one another expectantly. Well? Well, what? Asked Julian. I don't know anything about here. What do you know? Only what Mum told me, replied Darren in hushed tones, darting his eyes around quickly to make sure no one was listening. In the Christmas holidays she said something about Hedgewood's being the place. Separateness of wizards and non-wizards should be excluded from wizard affairs, where, at a distance John Talek circled past them, turning his head with ambivalence towards them. It was a long time ago, a time when my mother might have been here. She said Albus Dumbledore began it. But it wasn't just at Christmas. Now I think about it, Mum always talked about those warmongering wizards. I thought she meant the reciprocators, but I think she meant Albus Dumbledore. Or people at Hedgewood's at the time. It makes sense, with what Professor Longbottom had to say, nodded Julian. It's no wonder Septimus's uncle wanted non-wizards to attend. The bad times, said Rufus, half to himself. Both Darren and Julian waited for his friend to elaborate, which he did with much insightfulness. Mum and Dad were at school then, Rufus continued dreamily, half to himself, almost as if he had also been there too and was recalling a distant memory. The headmaster would call special meetings of the young Dumbledores, and they would practice dangerous spells, attacking spells, cloaking spells, legilimensy. They were in charge of disciplining the other students and they used these spells on them to find out how many had non-wizard sympathies, although most of the army didn't do very much. Lots of the students were outraged but kept their opinions quiet. Some didn't though, and when they left school went into the ministry determined to change the world that they saw had come about. He smiled at Darren and Julian. Mum told me that it was Cleus's uncle, and the reciprocators who helped prove that Albus Dumbledore was using the students for evil, and Alberforth Dumbledore took over. He joined the country with the European Wizarding Council so that it would never happen again. And you knew all of that? Asked Julian, aghast, glancing across to Darren. Rufus nodded, shrugging his shoulders. What else do you know? Only that, said Rufus, evenly. I didn't think it was all that important. Many people know it. A voice by Darren's shoulder came past softly into the inner part of the circle. Arella Bluewit smiled, the glimmer not going unnoticed by Julian, who smiled back. It's where conjurism comes from, don't you see? It began here. Conjurism began within Hedgewoods when Albus Dumbledore was headmaster. She pulled a chair over as Darren and Julian made way for her in their group. My father, mother, Uncle Mark were all there at the time, the girl continued. Your dad, Darren, Rufus's parents, Septimus's dad too. Even Sam Potter's parents. They all know what conjurism is, and how they were taught in lessons about wizardly superiority. Some believed them, of course. But some, like Rufus's parents, my mum, loads of others, did not. And they formed the Dash. Anti-CCs? Guessed Julian. Arella nodded her dark head. Can you imagine it, said Darren, scornfully. You wouldn't have been here. People in this country would be separate. Maybe even non-wizards not knowing wizards existed at all, Mum said. Can you imagine that? But Professor Snape saved it all with the universal link, went on Arella, her eyes wide with the telling. My mum said that by showing there aren't just wizards and non-wizards, there are people in between, made the conjurists' argument disappear. But, of course, it didn't, altogether. There were always some who carried on being conjurists, and being controlled by Albus Dumbledore, and, Arella broke off, and looked between Darren and Julian sharply, as if she'd said too much. It was clear to them all that the girl had meant her father and her uncle, and, probably, her brother too. Mum said they'd see sense in the end, she concluded awkwardly, and they have. They have done nothing other than help the non-wizard reciprocators. Mum is getting on famously with your mum, Darren. Darren nodded absently. Everyone got on with his mum, it was in her nature. Well, that's all I know, anyway, said Arella, pinking a little. Dad said that Albus Dumbledore meant no harm in it, except for educational purposes, but we know how it ended up. Albus Dumbledore met back up with Gellert Grindelwald, the head teacher at Durmstrang, and all this started up again. Mum said, if only their sister had not died, none of this would have happened. Rufus looked at Darren, who raised his eyebrows at what a fount of both relevant and interesting information their friend had been that evening, and smiled. She is pleased with Quibble, he added. I'm sorry that Septimus isn't here, said Arella, getting up. Can you promise that you won't tell anyone what I've said? You need to know to help get him back, right? Right, nodded Darren, adopting the cause quickly, for they had just been talking. Wow, said Julian, when she'd gone. Yep, said Darren, she's a genius. We can use this to help get Septimus back, can't we? Rufus picked up his friend Finder by the chain, dangling it in front of him as he drew his legs in and crossed them under himself. Septimus's quarter was pulsing a faint orange-red. He's walking somewhere, he interpreted, looking intently at the cruciform silvered metal with 4 discs slotted into each end. He's with Severus Snape. How can you know that from the friend Finder? Shot back Julian, glancing down at his. Curious Lupin said so. Do you think he knows about Hedgewoods and Albus Dumbledore? Do you think him leaving had something to do with it? I dunno, Rocky, said Darren, yawning heartily. I just miss him being around, you know. He's always so. Yeah, nodded Julian. calm in a crisis. Dependable. I hope he's okay. And with that, the 3/4 of the new marauder went off early to bed, all, too, at least, wondering what Septimus was doing, and where he was. One thing was certain, things just weren't the same without Septimus Remus Lupin. 88,888,888. Come on, Lily, you know that it couldn't be helped. Sirius Black moved away from the range in the kitchen as Lily Potter folded her arms unhappily. Someone had to go with the child, and someone had to replace Severus at Hedgewood's. He held out a cup of tea to his friend, which he thought she might rebuke, but instead Lily took it, her eyes red from exhaustion. It had been over a fortnight since Christmas, and her outburst against James and Petunia and, well, almost anyone who had got in her way. It seemed like such a long time ago, but that was only because January was dragging. The nights were still dark and the reciprocators coming home from morning shifts were tired and miserable, mainly from a lack of action. It was boring standing around in traditional conjurist haunts for hours on end waiting for something to happen. Maybe it will hasten a cause for him, you know, Sirius continued delicately. How is James? Lily turned her head to her friend. Sirius paused as he considered what to share. Bearing up, he replied. I think Remus can get better, Sirius. But, know that he did love Cecilia, once. He spoke to me about how distant she had become. Lily sipped her tea again, as if her action would prevent more words escaping from her mouth. He thought she may have been seeing Snape. Your help in the summer put paid to that theory, she added, pulling up a chair, before sitting on it and then resting her head on the table. Sam would do his internship application much better under Severus than with the new one. Lindveld, is his name? I've shown no one this, said Sirius, changing the subject suddenly, for she gave me this right in my hand just as I was about to leave on that morning. I have read it 100 times since Remus was bitten, and it still reads the same. He passed the oft-folded piece of paper to Lily, who opened it, read the contents and then returned to leaning against the table. Does that sound like someone who's given up on their marriage? Asked Sirius, when Lily said nothing. She came from a different place, she has different experiences, but somehow still loves him. Well, said Lily slowly, as she sat back up again, blinking hard at her tired eyes, born of work, worry and the night shift at St. Mungo's. It's more than I can say that about James. But I did love him, once, in my own way. I wish I'd listened to my heart. He'll be asleep by now, I expect. Won't be down for a while. He and a couple of newers did catch 2 young wizards trying to set light to a phone box last night. The Eras took them in. Sirius took a sip of tea and closed his eyes for a second. Why did you do it, Lils? I was handling it for you, I really was. You and Freya? Ah, said Sirius, folding his arms. Freya. She was worth it, even if it was only for 2 weeks. She began her college course for nursing this week, Tunks tells me. Lily nodded absently, as if only half listening. He has to want to do it, Sirius, proclaimed Lily, mournfully. That's all that's stopping him from responding to even basic medicine. It's as if one more step is needed, but he won't die. Merlin, you just want the world, Lily. Look who's given what up for you. She closed her eyes and nodded. I'm putting in a request for an investigation into your assignment, yours and Remus's, said Lily, her voice low, not looking at her friend. I want to find out how it was you both ended up there. Lily, said Sirius, as calmly as he could. It's not like it was James. It's none of your concern, really. He's ended up like this and it's none of my concern? Lily bit back her words with sourness. Curious. Did he do this on purpose? Did he send you off knowing, really knowing, there were dangerous half-breeds? If so, he needs bringing down. Sirius took a step towards her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder for a moment, feeling the panting of exertion in her chest at the upset. Would you listen to yourself? Calm down, Lily, and think rationally. You can, of course. But what good would that do you? You could destroy your family. Think of Harry, and Sam. Think of James. And besides, Callias is his brother, he's hardly likely to be unbiased. And what about Remus? How would he feel that you've initiated official proceedings against Cleus in the midst of all this trouble? In the dim of the small hours he could hear her breathe out, in silent defeat. You're angry, I know, he soothed as Lily still sat defiant. Let Cleus do what he does best, be a politician. He'll have more than enough on his plate with the declaration of wizards to overturn. And of course, I'll come back with you tomorrow, as long as you promise you'll speak to James. Lily's eyes widened in astonished protest. He just wants a discussion, Lils, that's all. About Sam. You owe him that much after 30 years of marriage. After a few moments' contemplation Lily Potter nodded and, getting up, she walked to the stairs. Through so many times she had gone and sat, waiting for people to go and she could be alone with her beloved, with her friend Sirius, back to Grimmauld Place and a discussion she knew could not be avoided any longer. 88,888,888. The school of Expertons stood proud in the landscape, its creamy white sandstone blocks reflecting the midday sun. At the top of a hill 3 miles away Septimus pointed down to it, a huge, white-walled castle which looked as if it had been lifted right out of the Middle Ages. Behind it, even in the mid-January cold, the indigo sea of the Atlantic glimmered and writhed like an enchanted snake. But, of course, the joke was always on the spectators. The snake was enchanting them, rather than the other way round, and the castle itself too, seemed enchanted, as if calling him, Septimus alone, to walk right through it, as if in a dream. Not far to go, Professor, he said, blinking sharply and forcing himself to look at the stone of the building, ignoring the thrall that the place was trying to put on him, before looking into Severus's face. His headmaster was also looking upon the school, bright and new, like a medieval palace, and Septimus was half expecting horses carrying knights on their backs, with lances and armor, their horses shrouded in livery. He was a little disappointed. It's just a spell, said his former headmaster, now his companion on the journey. Ignore the enchantment, your mind will get used to it. At least the time flies have gone, for now. Jump on. Septimus looked past Snape, and then down towards his hand, which was horizontal, palm down over the broadclad. This school likes to do things traditionally. We will be welcomed as friends if we arrive by broom. And what then? Then, said Severus Snape, heavily, then, you will have reached Constantine and you will have reached your goal. These, of your mother's, he gestured to his robe. They contain what that wizard needs to potentially help your father. In the absence of Cecilia Lupin, the custody and responsibility of these fall to you. Out of his cloak pocket, enchanted to shrink down the manuscripts, letters and information which had once been the scourge of Harry Potter's understairs cupboard. I wouldn't do that if I were you, said Severus, as Septimus was about to open up Cecilia's notes, which had been another reason the documents had to be shrunk and deposited in his pocket. It was soundproof too. Looks like a copy of The Art of the Wise. Not just any copy. This copy once belonged to Salazar Slytherin himself. Have you ever heard of his name? He was something to do with Hedgewoods, wasn't he? Indeed. It was taken by your father from the conjurist's house where he and Sirius were attacked. When the Aurors came to assist, the book was given for safekeeping to your Uncle Kay, who, by curious turn of circumstances, did not put it in the safe room at the ministry, but sent it with your mother back to Durmstrang on the day that she saw you off on the train to Hedgewoods. It was returned to me with her unique insights, and from there it has been in my care. If it were to open, as well as wakening the entire French countryside for 20 miles in any direction, you would see the annotations in her hand, ones which helped your uncle face down the challenge to Conjurer's trial in November, exposing the art of the Wize as a scam. Will you come with me? Asked Septimus uncertainly, his determination now beginning to falter a little. Keep them for me until we see Constantin? Help me explain. It was now the 11-year-old boy stood before his headmaster again as he asked Snape for help. I will, just as long as I am able. The entry to Buttons is tricky. It might allow us both in, or neither, or just you. But because it is you who seeks as wizard within its walls, it is you, Septimus Lupin, who must gain entry. And with that, Snape leaned one leg over his hardy broom. Septimus followed, after a second's thought, glancing down at his friend Finder. Blue in 3 of the spaces. They were up and going about their business at Hedgewoods. Pushing away a pang of sorrowfulness, Tabitha Penright watched as Septimus legged over the wide, iron-strong broom handle, holding on to Snape for dear life as they chased the last of the dawn away to the west.